All right, I'd like to call to order the policy meeting, noting that all board members are present. First thing to do is I need an approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I do not believe we have any public comments that came in. No one here to speak. And we'll jump right into the policies.
Right. That's good. We have about a dozen policies today, and just to kind of give you a little bit of an update on maybe what you might see after this. We spent much of our day yesterday with members of our admin team. I think we were in here we started about 8 o'clock yesterday morning. We concluded a little after 3 yesterday. We've moved through probably 90% of the 300 series. So once Rebecca and I get caught up with making sure our notes align, and then she can get those updated, we'll start moving those through the committee here. But they're going to come in larger chunks now than 10 or 12 at a time. And I think that'll help move us. I think the biggest piece will be once we see that, and it may be a conversation, Ted, we have to decide like how big a chunks do we want to bring, and then like to what level of detail do we want to take with those. I think it's from our end, it's important for us to make sure we stay ahead, but that's the piece we also got to manage your time to figure out what you can digest at once. So that'll be a little bit of a trial and error, but I think it's at least getting us moving with more than just a handful at a time and get us to our target of completing this. Jumping in, we're going to start off with primarily this is again continuing the 300 series. I know Amy's online, Tim is here. The first one we talked about was instruction in instrumental music lessons, and the recommendation from WASB was to keep our current policy because the PRG doesn't have one. Our recommendation is actually to repeal that one, because when we take a look at it, it certainly has some pieces and nuances about logistics around music lessons. Tim has worked at this policy since he's been here, and I don't think it's really one that's on an annual basis. It's one that is really part of our work. Music lessons are part of our program. We do incorporate them into our scheduling, and I don't believe that the policy pieces that we have here are really driving this on an annual basis.
Yeah, I think the most noteworthy part of the policy is the provision that a student can be pulled from classes if they rotate. Kind of minimize the impact on any one class. I've been here since 1999. We've never exercised that. So kind of the most noteworthy feature of the policy we haven't used. So, and I don't think we need a policy to do that, even if we had a need to return to that practice.
So motion to repeal.
Yep.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. The next one we're moving down is our grading systems, and we're going to take a look at 345.1 and 345.1 rule. What WASB is recommending is for us to replace our policy with one of their samples, which I think we generally agree with. But I know that Tim and Amy were going to review that just to make sure that there was nothing in there that was contrary to something that we had in our general grading practices. And then the rule, I want to pull the rule up for just a second, our current rule.
Oh, current rule.
Yeah.
Just give me a minute.
Sorry.
Bring that up.
It is really the one that talks about our specific grading system. And there are a few things that we wanted to update with regards to that. We'll talk you through that, but I think we'll keep the rule that we currently have, and there's just some nuances of language that we want to address.
Yeah, the next time you're here, we'll have the final version of this.
We'll bring it right to the board's level.
Yeah, what you'll see as changes are a few things. So one, you will see, and these are really just very small changes. So under the letter grade system, there will be 2 versions of withdraw. That was a conversation that we had before the pandemic. It never made it into policy. But it had to do with indicating whether when a student withdrew from the class, they were in a non-passing or a passing status. So it'd be clearer, I mean, it's still gonna be withdrawn on the transcript, but it'd be clearer to any reader of the transcript later on where the student was when they withdrew. So there was no assumption about their status when they withdrew. If that makes sense. So that's there.
There's no assumption, but. Is there a distinction then? Does it carry a distinction for now, maybe there's a. You assumed it was the negative. And I assumed it was the positive, and now it's stated.
It'll be stated clearly, yeah.
Who cares?
Well, I think, we had some students come to us that they were going, for example, they were going through some health concerns. And they might have been a higher achieving student, they might have been carrying a very heavy load. They wanted to kind of trim their load for a term as they navigated the challenge. Colleges might see those withdrawals and assume that they withdrew rather than taken.
Okay, all right.
Whereas we wanted to be able to communicate it was at the time of the withdrawal, they were in a passive status.
Okay.
The other thing that I think Amy can speak to has to relate to our elementary homeroom standards. So I don't know if Amy, it's not on here, but if Amy could just kind of describe very briefly what that would look like.
On the elementary report card, we have 2 scales. We have a separate scale for like our work habits. We don't grade those on a 4, 3, 2, 1. And so we just wanted to include that scale in this revision.
The other piece is under the pass fail. This was something that Tiffany brought forward, was that currently it states that no courses are to be offered on a pass fail basis at the high school or middle school unless articulated via someone's IEP or 504. So those are some things that for some of our students with disabilities, that may be something that is articulated there. So those would only be for those students that it's specifically written into those plans. And I think on the next page, we had a couple edits as well.
We'd also remove this rule hadn't been touched in about a decade. And when we moved to our current K-6 grading structure, we had language in there about what our transition would look like at the intermediate school.
Right.
And again, that's historical and it doesn't need to be in the rule today.
So the intermediate school transition, but 2013, 2015 at the very bottom there, that'll come out. But other than that, I believe that the policy that's being proposed as our general grading policy, you guys are okay with. And then with the changes that we just verbally articulated, then we will make on the rule or what we're proposing.
So we need a motion to bring this to the.
You can make a motion at both of those at the same time. And then what we will do is we will articulate out what Tim and Amy just discussed with regards to the rule.
So. Motion to bring both the policy and the rule to the board with the articulated changes that we discussed today.
Second.
All in favor?
And,
Aye.
And our next one is our student assessment policy 346. And basically what we're looking at here is to replace with the PRG sample that was included. I think that does a nice job with regards to just articulating generally what they hold, what the higher level assessment concepts are. We have a few other pieces that we will talk through with that, but as far as the assessment one, is it helpful for us just to go through like the policy, the rule, and the exhibit all at once, so you can kind of see
Yeah.
that whole picture?
Yeah.
So the initial policy 346, we're looking to replace that with the PRG. So that's the one that's associated with that. Our current policy is acceptable, but as we reviewed this, it just has some more modern language and we felt it fits our needs. As we look down to the 346 rule, policy on non-discriminatory testing. We feel we can repeal this one because the language on discrimination and non-discriminatory testing is already embedded within some of our other policies, particularly the ones around students with disabilities and English learners. So this is a policy that was a standalone, and the new language and approach to the non-discrimination statements are included within our other policies that we've already addressed. And then regarding the last piece here, which is talking about the annual notice of student assessment information. I think what I believe what we are looking at here is utilizing our chart that Tim and Amy bring forward on an annual basis and having this as an exhibit. That's not necessarily a policy where it needs multiple votes of the board, but something we bring back on an annual basis as part of our assessment plan. And I believe you usually bring that.
It comes in the summer and
That's
it
right.
comes to curriculum committee and then the board approves it annually as our assessment table.
So this outlines really what that is about. And then there are some things that we have from a noticing standpoint that we would utilize that document for. So this is the type of information that the curriculum committee and the board receives over the summer. It articulates out what all of our assessments are. And I believe that's really what the annual notice of student assessment information and what that exhibit is really calling for.
Do you usually give us one of these kind of charts? I don't know.
Yeah, this is the actual chart you would have gotten last summer.
Okay.
And so what we're looking for is when we read through this and looked at what the WSB was looking for here, we felt we had something that already fit that need, and we'd like to stay with that. We would also view that as being an exhibit to this policy, so that it's something that as we have changes or something changes within either our practice or by statute, that we can just make that change, we bring it to the board on an annual basis.
I move that we accept the student assessment changes as stated.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
46.1. All right, 346.1. You just bring that one up so people can see what that is. Is that that's the policy and non-discriminatory testing. We have that in here twice, or what? Maybe I don't think so. So that's when we just. That's when we just repealed, isn't it? Policy and oh, that's what we got. So that was part of that last batch. So this is the one that we are repealing because it's included with them. No, it's not. There's two things here. So you just go back. I'm a little confused here because we have 346 rule. So that's testing guidelines. We repealed that, right?
Yeah.
And then now what we're going to do is repeal the non-discriminatory testing. Pull up the rule because I may have misspoken what that was. Oh, all right. So what I was bringing up to you that you made a motion on was on the non-discriminatory testing. That was the one I was speaking to, that those non-discriminatory statements are within those. When you take a look at the testing guidelines, these are also part of the special ed and the limited English proficiency policies. So for this testing 346 rule, we would like to repeal that one as well. So I'll need a motion to repeal that one because these are already embedded in there as well.
Make a motion to repeal the rule 346.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Just to make sure you know what I did, Rebecca.
Yeah.
I jumped ahead a little bit on the non-discriminatory piece.
Yeah.
Student portfolios, this is something that is kind of a carryover from the 90s. As far as when that was kind of a big piece in education of looking at kind of students having more broadened portfolios as far as assessment of their work. We don't feel that that's something that's relevant any longer to have as a policy, so we recommend repealing that.
Motion to remove the student portfolio policy.
Second,
All in favor?
aye.
All right. All right, so. The next item is 347. And this is with regards to student records. So we're looking to replace our current 347 with the PRG model. Make sure I'm looking at the right one. Yeah, please, if you would. So what this one is just basically talking about is what are your student records? It's just to your basic definition of what those are. Our recommendation here is to replace this one. Is to replace our current policy with the PRG. We feel again, this just brings it up to current language with regards to student records. The rule confidentiality of student records is the next one that's associated with us.
That's the one that's 13 pages long.
Right, yeah, it's a longer one. And it really just talks through and kind of discusses what are your different types of records. There's two parts to this. First of all, we do believe that we should replace our current policy with the PRG 347 rule. There is a provision in here with regards to directory information, which is the next policy. And what I'd like to do is just talk to you about the directory data piece. So you have an understanding of kind of, well, at least what my perspective is. Ted, you and I talked a little bit about that when we did our review. We've got a little bit more information from the School Board Association. And I just want to kind of talk about it conceptually, then I know exactly kind of how I can write it and bring to you what that will look like. But I think from the student records piece, we're comfortable moving it into the PRG. And then once we make a decision with regards to the direction we want to go with directory data, we would include that as part of the line items that address that within this policy. So you can, if you'd like to, you can either hold on this till we actually finalize the directory data, or you can approve this and then making sure that this aligns with whatever decision we make on directory data. Either one's fine. But this just updates really the confidentiality of student records.
Just so you have it all.
Move it on. Or
I
wait,
would hold on it.
Hold it.
Sure,
That's what I would do.
put them together.
we'll put them together. Yep,
Yeah, I like that.
sounds good.
We need to vote on that.
No, we can just hold on it, and then I'll just bring that piece, I'll probably just bring it right to the board, is what I'm thinking, is to keep it going, so we keep these things together. But I think as we've reviewed this really addresses what needs to be there for student records and confidentiality, and then we'll add in the directory pieces. Jump into the last one we have for today. It's really one I just want to get a little bit of your perspective on as we kind of work on that piece. Is directory data is, I believe, they have the policy, is that correct, Rebecca?
No, we didn't
No,
get
you
that.
didn't get that one, all right. So let me give you a little background here.
Do you want me to run a copy of that?
No. It's fine. It's really conceptual what I need to talk to you about. Can you pull up our current directory data one? That would be helpful. So directory data is anything like sharing your student name, your address, your phone number. It can be degrees. It kind of think about all those things that are kind of personal identifying information is really what kind of identifies itself as directory data. You can kind of see how that's stated in the very first paragraph of our current policy. We are going to recommend that we adopt one of the PRGs or a version of it, because I think it just brings it into more modern language. But basically what our policy is we don't disclose any of that. The top information. There are certain places that we have to. And we have some provisions in here, like if you're participating in sports and you're on like the program, that's actually directory data. So you can So when I went to the basketball game the other night, and you had all the kids and their height and all those things, or those are all pieces that we have articulated here that we can continue to do. Talking about things with degrees and awards and scholarships and those type of things. But the top area ones, there's really two options you can go, and this is really how the PRG models are different. One of them opens it wide open, so that if somebody were to request directory data, we could then disclose that for all of our students. So if somebody came in and said, I'd like to know all the names and addresses and phone numbers of the families in your district, they could have access to it if you had an open directory data policy. Ours doesn't disclose any of that. And the reason we don't is that prior to my arrival in Waunakee, there was an issue where we were doing those booklets at the elementary level that would have like all the kids' class lists in them, and then their name and address and how you would contact parents. And it was mainly so that parents would connect in with for play dates, parties, etc. At some point in our past, somebody used that for commercial purposes. So at that point, the board took a look at the policy and just shut it all down. So for the last 15, 16 years, we haven't been able to really share that information. And it's been kind of I guess a point of struggle for particularly our elementary teachers and principals and our PTOs who have wanted to help provide that. We opened this up during COVID because kids were isolated, and we brought this to the board and asked for us to be able to share that in those specific instances. So what we've talked about with the School Board Association is we said, well, first of all, what do they see kind of in district policies? And what Barry Forbes shared with us was, we're definitely an outlier in that we don't share any of it. So my question to him was I'm not really interested in opening this completely up, because I don't want any, because the way that I think the statutes around directory data are written is it's kind of like any person may request. And if they request it and you have an open policy on it, then we would disclose that information. Certainly a piece that gets communicated on like annual notices to parents that they know what that is. But from my perspective, that's really not something I feel comfortable with. I just don't like that approach. But I want to be able to accommodate these situations where I think there's good reason to share directory data, such as, and as I was talking to Amy Johnson yesterday, it's really around these younger kids and helping to have families and kids be able to connect with each other. So we've talked to Barry Forbes a little bit about that, and it's not quite as simple as just saying, well, we can do this or this. So I think I can work through it and make it work if that's something that we're amenable to. But we run into kind of two different sets of laws. So you kind of run into the directory data pieces, you run into FERPA pieces, which are privacy, and then you run into public records. So those things don't always triangulate well together. But what I believe we can do is we can address some specific incidences and keep our policy where we do not disclose it, and then let people kind of actively choose to disclose it. So kind of like you would sign off on, I allow my child's name to be added to a class directory. One of the concepts we talked about is, could we add that to like the registration form, where we already do things like that for photographs. But those are a few pieces that I'd like to explore, and it's going to be a little bit nuanced where Rebecca and I have to figure out exactly with Barry how to write that. But that's kind of how I would like to kind of put it together. I also want to look at a few other things with regards to directory data. Tim brought up to me is, how does it kind of, where is the line of directory data when you have communications within school-sponsored activities? So if you have a club, FFA, DECA, sports team that's sharing information with like communication with parents through some of the, is that directory data, or is that something that you kind of sign up for as a parent whose kid's part of those programs? A little bit nuanced, but it's something I might as well explore before we kind of write the policy. But I'd like to try to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible, but also create an opportunity where we can share data, that seems appropriate. And that seems that if someone doesn't want it shared, they can either opt out or we can provide an option where people can opt in. So that's kind of my concept with it, but I wanted to bring that here to see if you're comfortable with that approach.
You've had so many open records requests. This is kind of primarily what's in your mind too, when you're making this
That's it.
policy.
Public records requests, you can't get information about like individual students. Like right now, you can't public records request us on these items because they're not. That's actually considered private information. We don't disclose that information at this point.
That's
It's
based on us. That's not.
It's on us. And if you were asking for information on a student, it also falls under that, the issue of privacy for like families and student records. So there's a few, so I'm not as worried about it from the public records perspective. It's more of, I really don't want to turn them over. But I know that there are specific instances where I have to do it with military recruiters. If we let them in if we let colleges in to talk about their programs to our schools, then by federal law, we have to allow them to recruiters to come in. And I believe that there's some information that they can get, names and addresses. That's by federal law. But I'd like to be able to create an option where someone can get, if you're a kindergarten parent, you can find out the child your kid has met on the playground. How do you kind of connect together? That's really what I think parents are looking for. But I'm not as worried about it from the public records. It becomes a public records thing that I brought up because just how the laws are written and then how you write the policy.
Yeah.
It's important to my policy writer more than it is probably to me practical.
I appreciate your thought process behind it. I think that it's, really dialed into our thinking of those things. You're dialed into our community and our parents and our families, and those are the needs. When you talk about the connections, I mean, that's a priority of our district, and make sure that we can facilitate connections among families and kids. And then also, when you talked about it in relation to perhaps sharing how that would look with activities like DECA and things like that, there's definitely that's an area where I think it's important that we provide information to make that more manageable.
Right.
So I appreciate your thought process behind it, and I think it makes sense to continue to work towards.
So one of the things I want to also look into, and I think it's changed over time with the technology that we have and some of the partnerships we have with groups. But when you look at like Project Graduation, we look at the scholarship drive, we look at post prom. A lot of that, we do a lot of the communications, we push it out through our meetings. So even though it may be an outside group or an outside parent group that's kind of organizing it, we feel that there's value to it. And we push those out to our. So I don't believe we have as much anymore where that's been a question of sharing information. Either, and I'll have to look into that with our high school folks, but I know Katie, you've worked with some of those. I'm not sure, Ted, if you've been part of it with any of your kids. But I'm not sure if we have the sharing of information or contact info there, or we're more relying, I think, on kind of our technologies that we have, and we just push it out on behalf of those groups.
Yes.
That's more of what I'm seeing, I believe, which then doesn't create that doesn't create an issue for us. But if a group wanted to send something privately, like to them, that wasn't associated with us, then it would be a direct data. But I want to also make sure that we're supporting those groups that are doing the good things for us, and we can get the word out there. I think we have ways that we can be the communicator of it, and they can help put together the communications.
Is there any issues with the current and future technology of when you think of how many people have phones, how many kids have lists, and I don't know if TikTok works in there, or you just realize that there's ways to get to kids without having it official. Are we looking ahead as to what kind of controls there are, or we don't have any controls?
You can try to do, and there's the technology, it's separate from this issue, I would say right now, because that would be things that kids would be opting in on private devices.
On their own.
This would be something that we would turn over to a group. But things like this, you bring up things like TikTok, we can block things like TikTok on our network, for example. But what kids do is they just turn off their data. They turn off their Wi-Fi and they go on their personal data and then it goes around our system.
Yeah,
So, I mean, there's some other things you can do, but that's becoming more difficult.
And your technology policies are coming later in the 300 series. So I
Okay.
mean, I think, you're touching on some really important questions, Judy. And, Rick was in yesterday going over policies. I mean, as Randy said, there are some things we can do to impact the use of cameras in the school, but and we do have some policies on that, but there's other things where practically we can't.
yeah.
have that.
Well, and you write a policy and 2 years later, it doesn't make any sense anymore.
There's some of that, yeah, the technology is moving quick, so that's a piece that. Rick's working on. There's two different acceptable use policies. One is associated with the students and one with staff. They're very similar, but they have some nuanced differences. He's reviewing those with kind of what the current practices are and then what's in the laws are. Because like your acceptable use policies are more generally, they have some provisions everybody has to have in there, but they're more generally kind of locally developed. So those are coming. We work on some of those. Yeah.
Maybe looking at those first 8,
Yep.
name as a student, like maybe there's subsections of it, like I don't want, maybe there's part of that information, like telephone number, everyone has a bunch of telephone numbers, there's no email address on there, is an email thing, and like, is there stuff that isn't,
Right.
that we're not thinking of, you're gonna turn this over. Maybe some of this isn't acceptable, but something else is, like the list you gave out for contact for the community section, I gave out emails, I didn't want to give out anyone else's
Right.
personal information, and maybe there's something to consider, well, we'll get you into the door this way, we'll give you this information, you gotta go, you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And those are all things to be thinking about, yeah, because I think the items that are listed here, I believe, are listed as part of statute as far as directory data.
Right, so as Randy mentioned, the first 8, these are examples of what FERPA considers directory data. So if you went with just a plain vanilla approach, these would be the types of information that would be viewed as directory data and shareable. But as a school board, as we're discussing here, you have the ability to create greater protections where you feel it is appropriate and would impact programs and operations in a negative way. So that's where those 8 come from.
Yeah, I've just been trying to think through, what do we need operationally? What makes sense when we work with our community? What do parents and community want to know? And then just trying to protect those things from things that really might be nice to know, but they don't need to have. I want to make sure we can still do the things that we have with our athletic teams and our music programs. We have programs with kids' names in it. That's all acceptable.
There's a whole section in here about interaction with law enforcement and other agencies for keeping records is. I think of today, is there issues like we've got kids in school who have what we call records from the delinquency or
Sure.
law enforcement.
Yeah.
Are we protected with that stuff, that we kept it private, or that parents know we've got a pedophile in the 9th grade or something? I don't-
Right, well, we
What's out
do
there?
get lots of records. I mean, the
Yeah.
ones that I think are the ones that are most challenging is medical records. Because those have to be separate. And we try to stay out of that business. And that was a lot of the things when we looked at over the last few years. We stayed clear of like, that we may have helped with certain things, but we didn't keep records of things. So I didn't want to keep a record of your immunizations for COVID, who got it. I don't want all that stuff. And we do run into it occasionally when we have particularly some kids with some very specific needs, and there's some records that are created. But we have to be really cautious of those. But yeah, all of those things are confidential. They're all handled a little bit differently. Some of them have provisions statutorily around them or from guidelines. But yeah, that's all stuff we're pretty well aware of and needing to figure out how we handle them and then what can be held together and what needs to be separate. But we try to stay away from, for example, medical records at all, if at all possible, because that's not what we want to get in.
And when you say medical records, you're also talking mental health. But I'm looking at adjudication issues.
We get things from the court system, so right
Same
now,
thing.
there's if there's a student who's. Being adjudicated through the youth system, we'll get a notification of it. That usually just gets turned over. It's usually a letter to me, and then I turn it over to usually. Whatever principal or student services that have it, and that becomes. Is it a record that gets filed? Something we receive as more of an FYI. It's not a record we create. So, but
And to your point, kind of, is it worth making other parents aware that we have an individual in this classroom?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. It's private, but yet. After the fact, something happens and we knew he was a problem.
some of it you can, some of it you can't by statute. I mean, you see those things like,
You can't do it before
you'll
the fact.
occasionally see when there's someone who's on the circuits registry and moves into a community. And then there'll be an announcement of that in the paper, and sometimes we work with the police to push those out. There's also provisions where you have somebody who may be on the registry. I mean, we're kind of deviating off of this, but I'm happy to answer the question, Judy. Is they want to, they're on the registry because of something that happened at one point in their past. Now they have a kid who plays in a sport or is going to be in a concert and they'd like to attend it. It's a public event.
Mhm.
And mostly what those provisions are is they're allowed to attend as a parent. But they have to let us know that they're going to be attending. So those happen a couple times a year. And usually that's associated with a letter from whoever is from law enforcement supporting them. So those are the kind of things that,
Well, I knew there was a lot of detail in here and I wasn't understanding it all, but I figured
yeah,
it's being covered.
yeah, a lot of those pieces are covering. Yeah, any of the things that could be considered confidential that we have to make sure that we're watching.
Okay.
Getting more complicated. Judy.
I know, and then you get blamed after the fact.
But again, the bias, even under, simply under law is towards privacy.
Yeah.
So, for example, we conduct randomized drug testing of student athletes. We have certain health services that are reimbursable under Medicaid that are through our special education program. All of those would, if HIPAA applies out of school, it would apply to the records in school. But the stronger protection, FERPA doesn't undercut HIPAA protections and vice versa.
Okay. And we've got all those in place. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
That's what we have for today. And Rebecca, we have another meeting set up, is that correct?
We do.
Our next meeting is actually scheduled for March 16th at 9:30 in the morning.
And we'll
I
start,
guess, do you want to just see what we get, or do you want to ask them how whether they want to?
I think you and I just need to, it's probably something that when we meet with you, Ted, we'll figure out kind of how large of a chunk we want to take. And see what that's gonna entail. Some of them go quicker than others and some are a little bit more detailed as you've seen with a few of these that are longer.
Mhm.
So yeah, but as we work through them, we'll set up a time with you to kind of review them and then we can decide how we want to chunk them off for the committee.
And I think that's how I kind of said, it, depending on the nature of them, some are really short, there's no.
Right.
So quantity isn't really the issue, it's just.
It's kind of how you want to, where you want to put your break, where we may have ones that we have discussions on, but yeah, after our work yesterday, we'll start pulling those together.
So I think we're to the end. Take a
Motion to adjourn. Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Amy.
everybody. Thanks, Amy. Good luck with your furnace.
Stay warm.
Yeah, thank you.
I will be coming back from a trip and I think I'll be here on the 16th, but if I couldn't, do you prefer to get